I'm going to be talking about an election in which there was a petition within the Supreme Court about whether the opposition or the government, the ruling party, actually won. And the Supreme Court justices ruled in favor of the ruling party. And some of the things I'm going to be talking about would basically focus around issues of the Constitution, the civil society. Kenya has a very vibrant and active civil society. Corruption. You think it's bad in some countries, this would probably be an example where it's done at its best. And then there would be war crimes, which has been something which has been a big subject about Kenya over the last maybe 2-3 years. We have currently a president and a vice president who are facing crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court at The Hague. And there's always a question of what does it mean to have an elected leader who's also facing such big crimes at an international court. And I'll also talk about universal representation. This is something that I genuinely strongly feel about. And Kenya is one of the countries, in spite of being in a region that hasn't advanced in a lot of issues, has done much in terms of advancing at least gender representation within the electoral process. It's still not very good, but it's much better than what you'd be able to find in the region. So Kenya is a country within the eastern part of Africa. There it is. And it's bordered by the Indian Ocean to one side and countries which are also struggling a lot, like Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, but now South Sudan because there was a breakup between the two Sudans. And then you have the Uganda and further down the Democratic Republic of Congo and Tanzania. And if you're familiar with international politics, you would definitely be aware that these are a number of countries which have a lot of issues of their own. And for a long time, Kenya has been like the beacon of hope for the region. It's been this one country that people have considered like something worth emulating until things changed at a certain point in the year 2007, as we're going to be looking at in a bit. It's a country of 44 million people. The main economic sources come from agriculture, some bits from tourism, but the service industry still is the main field which employs the most people. There are three independent arms of government. We have an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary. At the moment, these are very clear and distinct arms. Before that, did not used to be very clear, up until 2008 when we passed a new constitution. It used to be executive, executive, and executive, wherever you would look at it. Kenya is known for its runners. That's the other thing we're very proud about. But it's also known about something else, and that's poverty. About 38% of the people in the country live below what is called the absolute poverty line, and that's living living under $1 a day. Very corrupt country, ranked as about 139 out of the 176 countries that are ranked by Transparency International. Human Development Index puts it at 145 out of 186, so not the worst certainly, but not doing very well. Very diverse country, a lot of distinct ethnic groups. Some are much similar than others, like you'd have two ethnic groups that speak languages that are pretty much similar. But these are still very distinct groups. About 42 are recognized, the main ones being the Kikuyu, the Luhya, the Luo. I insist on mentioning these because you would see they play a critical role in terms of the electoral process in the country. We are very tribal in the way we execute our elections. I've added the sixth one there for no particular reason other than that that's my tribe. I'm a Kisi, and I really needed to fit it in there. So I added a sixth one in there. So Kenya has a long history, but the history that would be important in terms of understanding its electoral process probably would date back to the early 20th century, when you had British, when you had the beginning of British occupation within the settler lands in Kenya. These are like the very agricultural productive lands within the country. And it basically developed as a trade route and then proceeded to become actual occupation. And what happened, especially at the time when there was a big construction of a rail path from the Kenyan coast towards the Ugandan border, there was a lot of displacement of communities that lived within the region, which was the more fertile land, towards some reserve areas that were very infertile. And most of the land that was centered around the most productive areas was eventually occupied by a minority settler group from overseas. But this led to an independence struggle movement that was called the Mau Mau, which was more of a guerrilla war. Clive yesterday mentioned something about a guerrilla war. Basically, tactics of hide and hit, basically. Targeted, very secretive and targeted militia kind of attacks onto the settler group. But this was repressed heavily by the settler government at that time in what was a very violent and one of a period of history of the country that people really try to forget, but they cannot move on. For example, recently there was a case that was presented here in the UK against the settler government at that time because of crimes against humanity that were committed then. The case was settled out of court, so it did not come to full argument in the court. But it shows you that even many years later, people still feel very strongly about it. The founding president's name is Jomo Kenyatta. If you had a look at the readings that were there for you, you must have come across the name. And at the core of this, Mau Mau guerrilla war is land. Yesterday we talked about Zimbabwe and land, and in Kenya it's always been about land as well. And the communities that have been mainly affected by this displacement in terms of land have also been the ones that have been more violent or more vocal when any electoral process comes up. Kenya gained independence in the year 1963. The first president is there, Jomo Kenyatta, who ruled between 1963 to 1978. Then came Daniel Arap Moi, who's the second person here, who ruled for a period of 24 years. And for people like myself, it was like since when I was born until I thought I would never see him ever leaving power. And he was a very tough ruler. Everything was about him. If you read the reading that was the first reading, you'd find that basically he believed in something called l'état c'est moi. I'm everything. Whatever I say, it's final. But as we look at later, there was an opposition that came in and took over in the year 2002. And the current president, whom I mentioned has some cases at the International Criminal Court, is called Uhuru Kenyatta, who happens to be the son of Jomo Kenyatta, the first president. We'll see why that is important eventually. In 1992, Kenya introduced multi-party democracy. Before that, it was one party. It was KANU and KANU. If you're not in KANU, you're not in government. You're not in any political process. But this form of multi-party politics that came in the year 1992 was interesting. Voting was by what you call queuing, mlolongo. So basically, you would come in as a candidate and stand, and then everyone who wants to vote for you would come and stand in a queue behind you. And you can only make a guess how the winner of the election was determined. So it was multi-party democracy on paper, but not clearly anything more than what was there before, where KANU had a control of everything. The opposition then was very fragmented, which has been a problem for the opposition for a very long time until the year 2002 when they came together. So there were various parties that had their strongholds within particular ethnic groups. And for some reason, mainly historical, they were not able to come together and provide a force against Moi, who was then the ruler. And President Moi himself was very good at divisive politics. He knew exactly how to make sure that they did not get a chance to come together. So that's something he definitely played very well. And the election was overwhelmingly won by KANU, which followed a period of tyranny where there was a lot of impunity, corruption, scandals. For students like myself, it was forced patriotism, you know. We sang about Moi every single morning and evening in school. Every time he would visit, we would have a lot of rehearsals about singing for him, all the praises. He was the first farmer, the first Christian, the first father, everything. He was number one. So it was number one Moi. Anything you want to think about, you would add his name to that. And he basically controlled all institutions. If you talked about the judiciary, he had a control over it. The police, the media. We only had one broadcaster then, which was the national broadcaster. There were a lot of political assassinations which happened at that time that haven't been solved until today. And there is a new name I would like to mention, and this is Ruto, who happens to be the current vice president of Kenya. And basically, he was the architect behind the win of President Moi in 1992. Then he was a very young man, just after leaving university politics, where he was a student leader. And he basically ran the violent campaign that enabled Moi to be able to come into rule after the initiation of multi-party politics. And the main site of the violence centered around the region where Moi and Ruto come. They come from the same ethnic group and the same region. And this is the region that has been affected by violence at pretty much every single election, other than the last one, in which they won. So, and then coming 1997, when now there was a more formidable opposition, but still very fragmented. For the first time, there was a lady coming in to vie for political office, and she did very well. There were minimum constitutional reforms that had been initiated at about that time, mainly forced because of outside pressure by the donors. And this, for example, put some bit of changes in the Electoral Commission, but not changes that would be enough to facilitate a free and fair election. Nairobi has always voted strongly in favor of the opposition. That was not the case in the rural areas, where the electoral process is less checked and probably less credible. The vote was challenged at the appeal court. That was the highest court then. But of course, you can guess that the government won. But they won on a technicality, and you can imagine what technicality that was. They won because the government, the president, was not served with the election petition. So you are the opposition. How do you walk to the president and serve him with an election petition so that he can turn up in court? And because they were not able to do that, the case was dismissed. So, and this was basically similar circumstances under which several election petition cases for very prominent politicians were dismissed at that time, legally, but through a technicality. Then we come to the year 2002, and this was basically the time when the people came into power. There was a lot of nationalism happening at that time. The two groups which were vying then were, one was called the National Alliance Rainbow Coalition, NAC, which was the opposition. And then, of course, there was KANU, which was now the ruling party. The NAC candidate is the former president of the country. His name is Mwai Kibaki, who just left power this year in 2013. And the KANU candidate, forced even on the KANU members themselves because they did not want him, he was a total political novice. He'd not been active in politics until then, happens to be the current president, Uhuru Kenyatta, who at that time was overwhelmingly rejected. And if you had a look at the first reading, you would understand the history behind that as well. And again, forgive me for introducing a lot of names today, but the main opposition candidate in Kenya at the moment is called Raila. And Raila basically is the one who enabled Kibaki to come to win. As you can see, Kibaki is on a cast. He had a road accident before the election, had to go abroad for treatment for a very long time. And at that time, the person who ran the campaign is the Raila Odinga, who now is the opposition who's fighting with him through the election petition. The other funny thing is that Kibaki himself had been in KANU for a very long time, even one time giving a quote that has been quoted over and over, saying that defeating KANU would be like cutting a big tree, which is common in Kenya, called the Mugumo tree because it has many roots. It would be like cutting that tree with a razor blade. So he mentioned that at one time, but here he is coming in on the opposition to defeat KANU. I still remember where I was when that election did happen, when it was declared that I grew up in a very rural area where the only broadcaster we used to listen to was the national broadcaster, as it sang all the praises about the government at that time. But all of a sudden, there was a change of tone and them talking about the opposition having won, because they knew definitely now that would be the new government and they had to change the tune as soon as that was declared. So it was a really big election. So what happened after NAC came into power is what was utterly disappointing. This was the critical moment at which the country probably could have moved forward. But there was massive corruption that did happen at that time. There was a memorandum of understanding that had been signed by the political parties in opposition at that time. You've seen one politician called Charity Ngilu mentioning that we would not be separated again. So there was this memorandum of understanding on how they were going to share government positions, on how they were going basically to share their varied agendas from their parties, but it was never honored. Kibaki, who came into power at the time, basically did everything at his terms, and that eventually caused a lot of discord within the opposition and eventually led to actually disintegration of the opposition. But there was something else which happened which was really critical. One of their campaign policies was free basic education, and they were able to achieve that. So there was basic education from grade 1 to grade 7 guaranteed and paid for by the government. That was not there before, and that made a big difference in the way things were done after that. Yeah, so there was a lot of massive corruption that did happen, has been documented a lot by this one person who's an academic here in Oxford, came to be an academic in Oxford after going on exile because he basically was a whistleblower about a major corruption scandal that involved a lot of key government people at that time. And they just believe that it's our turn to eat. Look, KANU has been eating for the last 24 years. We have come into power. It's our turn to pay back for what they have done for all these years. So it was corruption with impunity and without any regret whatsoever. Then we come to the next election that happened in 2007. And this is an election many people would wish to forget that it actually did happen. The election pitted two groups. There was an opposition group, which was called the Orange Democratic Party, or DM. And the government group that time formed a coalition with other fallout groups from the opposition and themselves, which they called the Party of National Unity, PNU. So we had the Orange Party and PNU, the Party of National Unity, going head-to-head within this election. The election basically focused about the issue of historical injustices, one of them being land. Look, we were displaced from settler land many years back. So that was the key thing that was there at this election. And something else I did not mention was that Uhuru Kenyatta, who's the son of Jomo Kenyatta, the founding father, both of them the family owns large tracts of land. You are going to see it coming up later in the last election that just happened in March this year. Because what happened is after independence, when Kenyatta came into power, he basically took over large tracts of the very fertile land that was meant to be for resettlement of the people who had been displaced. But because he had liberation credentials, we talked about that yesterday, nobody was willing to challenge him. He'd been in prison for a long time. He'd done so much and sacrificed a lot as a person for the liberation of the country. So people thought it's just okay to do that. And imagine some of the regions where this land was taken over from includes his own backyard. So the people in his own area too are not very happy with him about that. Not just people in maybe other regions. The other bit which happened during that time was there was excessive hate speech, community against the other. There was a rise of local ethnic radio stations, the vernacular radio stations that came up, each broadcasting their own information. So there was no one single message coming up from a central Nairobi government. You could be in a certain region speaking your own language and totally being far removed from what was happening in another region. And as you will see, this is something that pretty much contributed a lot to the violence that followed that election. The electoral process was very much flawed. The opposition were very quick to bring their results very quickly. Some of them clearly doctored. They showed more than 100% voter turnout in some of their strongholds. But they were very keen to bring this out very quickly and basically have the election declared much earlier. But what happened with the ruling parties, they were quiet a bit, waiting until all the opposition votes have come in before theirs start to come in now. And when they started to come in, they asked the opposition, look, in the morning, as you had the lady who represented the opposition, the Honorable Martha Karua speaking, in the morning when your votes are being read, you were quiet and happy. But now that our votes are being read, suddenly it's hurting your ears. So what has changed? And that pretty much tells you what basically happened in that electoral process. So we come to the period between 2007 and 2013. After the country went through a very difficult period. I didn't want to put any clip at all to represent what happened in that time because most of it was very graphic. There was a memorandum of understanding that was brokered, mainly by a lot of force by international powers. that basically forced the opposition and the government to come together and be able to form a coalition government, just like you had in Zimbabwe yesterday, a coalition government being formed. This was brokered by what is called the Panel of Eminent Persons, which is basically a group of very prominent and well-respected African leaders, including the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. And what resulted was a government that was totally bloated, very expensive to run, 41 cabinet ministers. Parliament went through so much excesses that were not checked. There was massive corruption because everyone believed they were the government and they were not responsible for being checked by the other. So the opposition continued continued their corrupt practices within the government, and the government itself continued with what they were otherwise doing before. And there were total dysfunctional ministries. The ministry I am most concerned about is the health ministry, for example, where there were 2 health ministers who, because they were always bickering and not agreeing about anything, pretty much nothing got done in terms of implementing any policies. And then, but there was some positive that came out of that particular election. Because of the violence that people had witnessed, during that process of trying to broker a coalition government, basically what happened is that the Panel of Eminent Persons went further than just addressing that particular election to look at the wider structural problems that are there. One of them being addressing the Constitution. In what ways, for example, were they going to initiate a process in which the Constitution was going to be reformed, looking more at the institution level other than at the individual particular election. The other thing that they considered was how to address the violence that had occurred in the country after that election. And in trying to address that violence, what basically happened is that they created a process in which some of the key actors of the violent process were going to be prosecuted. And this is what led to the prosecution that's currently going on at the International Criminal Court. So a new constitution was passed. Some of the key issues in the new constitution included a devolved government. 47 different smaller regions were created. These regions were meant to act in a semi-autonomous way, where they would basically have a governor who would be responsible for the day-to-day running of the various service provision within the region. But still, there would be still some activities that would be centrally located and run within the central government located at the city in Nairobi. Yeah, I have mixed views about a devolved government, especially when it comes to issues like healthcare, for example. You can imagine when you have 47 different regions trying to manage something as vital for a country as healthcare, for example, what that means. But there's a lot more good you can look at when it comes to devolution. One of them being that regions that had been marginalized for a very long time would still be able to get their share of the national budget and be able to implement it locally for their own policies without waiting for a certain proportion to be allocated to them by the central government based on their loyalty, lobbying, or any other factor that would be considered. The other bit that was there in the new constitution was the creation of the upper house, which is the Senate, mainly to deal with the county governments. And there was also entrenchment in clearly written way in the constitution of the Bill of Rights, which is something that was not there in the constitution before. And the other bit was a statement that not more than 2/3 of the members of any elective public body would be of the same gender. In other words, if Parliament decides that you're only going to elect members of a particular gender, then you would be forced to nominate an equal number to balance it by at least 1/3 to meet this constitutional requirement. If we had an election in which there were 100 parliamentary seats, and as is very customary in regions like Kenya, only male members of parliament are elected, then that means that political parties would have to find a way, based on their strength in parliament, of nominating women to meet at least 1/3 the number of 100 to be able to meet the constitutional requirement. And this went further to also apply to every other elective and appointment officers throughout the county governments and the national governments. During the process, there was a reformation of the judicial process. There was a total overhaul of the judicial system. It's not perfect, but it's as close to good as you would want in any country. Before that, as I mentioned, we had basically judges who were either puppets or marionettes of the central government, and they would make rulings that would be anyone else's guess. But at least at the moment, we have a slightly independent judiciary that was appointed in a more fairer, open process. Of course, that doesn't weed out all judges that might be compromised, but it's a much better way than what we had before. The other bit that we've talked a little about and probably worth exploring a bit more is the crimes against humanity that the two current leaders of the country are facing. So we have a president and a vice president who've been accused of having committed particular crimes. Does it mean that they remain to be not guilty until they are actually proven to be guilty? And that was the big question that came up all the time during the campaign. So you had two groups coming in the 2013 elections, which just happened this year in March. You had the Jubilee group, which is currently in power, and you had the Coalition for Reforms and Democracy, CORD, which is the opposition, being run by Raila. An election which is going to be held under a new constitution, a constitution that has empowered various arms of a democratic government, such as the judiciary, a reformed electoral commission, and something else that had been introduced within the electoral commission is what we talked about briefly yesterday, a biometric system, an electronic system of verifying voters and transmitting election results. The discussion we had yesterday is probably it's too expensive to implement. In Kenya, we actually went the entire way to be able to create such a system, in which instead of having a returning officer board a plane with a piece of paper to go to the National Tally Center and present it, we could have an electronic system in which everyone, wherever you are, you could be able to see on a screen what votes are coming from what region. And even though the final vote would only be read after all the submissions have been made, it would be much more transparent because you would have already seen what the trend is going on in the regions. So this was meant to be a very credible election, isn't it? I mean, we have reformed institutions, new constitution. So we'll have a look at what happened. The other bit which was very important also is there was a very active diaspora. The Kenyans who are abroad were very involved in the electoral process at this time. I remember, for example, joining a group of people in the US at that time, and we had basically discussions with the electoral commissioner when he visited and a few other people to talk about ways in which we were most concerned about how we were going to vote as the diaspora. That did not happen, of course, because of various technicalities. But beyond that, we also talked about ways in which the electoral process was going to be made to be much fairer. And the reason the diaspora is very keen to participate in the country is that they contribute a significant part of the GDP for the country. They basically, overseas remittances from people working abroad is a huge part of Kenya's budget. So they also need to have a say in terms of what happens. So you have leaders who've been indicted. Should they step aside or should they still go on and be on the ballot? You've seen several of the opposition people saying, no, you cannot stand when you have crimes, you're defending some crimes. You better stand aside until that is sorted before you drag the whole country with you. And they basically used this to their advantage. What they decided to do is that they were going to tell Kenyans that it's us against them. This is the Western idea that are trying to probably take us, your people, as they said, your sons, lock us away, and if you are okay with that, then you should support them. And it was like they're rallying, it was like what they used to rally the government side towards voting overwhelmingly for them. So it was, instead of turning to be against them, it was the one thing that they used basically in terms of bringing in numbers on their side. The other bit which is very important when you look at politics in the region is the role of the international players. You're talking about America, you're talking about Britain, for example. They also had ideas on what they thought should be going on. The British Foreign Secretary, for example, at one time came to Kenya and basically told people that they would have only, they should be prepared that it's their choice, but if they vote, they should be prepared for the consequences of electing a leader who, for example, has something else to worry about instead of running a country. The same thing was for the Americans as well. But President Obama gave a speech that many people interpreted as being very neutral, but for the government side, they interpreted it as being in support of their cause, in that nobody should interfere with the electoral process in Kenya. He was very clear and candid in terms of saying, it's your election, we would support you in whichever way you choose to go. And yeah, we are basically outside players supporting you as a country, and you can make your own decision. But what happened immediately after his speech was that 2 US diplomats came up and differed on what they thought that meant. One undersecretary clearly saying that choices have consequences. So you can imagine a foreign diplomat coming to a country and mentioning to them that, look, you're electing leader X and Y, please be aware that choices do have consequences. So it's upon you to decide, but if you elect them, there would be consequences about that. And immediately a former undersecretary comes in and says, no, that is not right. We are America, we are a different country, we are not even signatories to the ICC process, therefore we don't have any business telling you what you should do. And that left a lot of people confused in terms of what is the message being sent from abroad about the electoral process. So Kenyans went to vote in 2013. Some people had predicted voter apathy in terms of the electoral process, but still there was overwhelming turnout, 86%. And something else happened though. This was an election that put Uhuru and Ruto on one side and Raila Odinga on the other. During the entire voting process, as we had mentioned earlier, it was meant to be a well-checked system where there was an electronic process to be able to determine how the voter system had been happening at the regions, and then votes being transmitted electronically before they actually reach the final tally center. But what happened is at a certain hour, this electronic system failed. What happened to the electronic system, nobody knows, but it actually did crash and therefore it did not work. So basically what we went back to is the initial way of transmitting votes back from the tally center by a returning officer who gets onto a plane and travels all the way to Nairobi to the final tally center. And that basically formed the basis of the case argued at the Supreme Court in March this year against the election of the current government, the Jubilee coalition, during that particular election. And as a final bit, probably to mention, and this is basically a parting shot, there was a backlash by Kenyans against Western media. So there was a piece, for example, that was aired by CNN trying to talk just before the election about, oh, there would be violence. Kenyans are trying to shape up for a process that's going to be very violent. And people thought that probably that was not very accurate. So there was a lot of humor trying to mock the Western media. I can give an example. There is a picture which circulated a lot in social media showing a Western journalist who's crying because he'd come in and left without any violence actually happening. And the picture at the bottom here is basically a Kenyan child trying to look very miserable by smearing some bit of flour on himself, waiting for the Western media to come and take a picture of him as a very miserable child trying to get some help from abroad. So, yeah. But the other bit that you did read from the piece of reading that was there was that, honestly, there was censored speech in the entire process. People were very careful about speaking about things that were very emotionally charged. We'd come through a very painful period, and people did not want to bring back the same painful experiences of 2007 in terms of openly discussing about anything that was happening, including genuine plans for violence in Region X or Region Y. And that was basically the whole idea that the reading was trying to address, where even journalists themselves, who are usually more credible in Kenya and very active, suddenly found themselves trying to be very cautious in terms of what they could say so that they do not alarm anyone. And we've now come beyond the election. We still have problems happening even after the election. The case has been argued, the government side has won, and people are asking, what next? And probably that would be the basis for our discussion today. Yeah, thank you very much.